Well, thank you to this hardcore who braved rain on a Saturday evening to be here. Now, the ideal of Satyagraha is not something that's normally connected with architectural practice, so I should start by explaining how I came to draw the connection. And it comes from years of thinking about how we architects validate our practice, which is a challenge because architectural practice has an intangible bottom line. If you were to ask the head of a large manufacturing corporation, were the last 10 years successful, the chances are that the answer would be significantly shaped by looking at quantitative measures such as profit earned, growth rate, market share, patents granted, share value, etc. But if you were to ask an architect who's passionate about design, where that passion is the reason for being in the field, it's unlikely that quantitative measures would shape the answer that much, and it would probably depend more on a qualitative assessment of buildings designed in that period and were they good buildings or were they not. And these are intangible assessments that cannot be measured precisely. So one tends to feel the need for some validation beyond one's intuitive satisfaction, and usually one turns to social validation. So architects tend to turn to, looking at design awards won, publication in reputed journals and books, invitations to the lecture circuit, the seriousness with which the work is discussed in architecture schools, etc. And these are all valid measures, but when they become the dominant mode of validation, they tend to breed a self-referential culture where architects are designing more for other architects than for the constituencies they should be serving. So thinking about this self-referential turn, I started asking, are we too quick to don our professional hats in thinking about architecture? We are humans before we are architects, and is it that to create a humane architecture, one must first come rigorously to terms with what it is to be human before one starts thinking about architecture? And that's the path that led me to Satyagraha. So my presentation will have 4 parts. First is a discussion on what the word Satyagraha means. Then I will talk about how it's reflected in the nature of our consciousness. Then I'll draw a connection to architectural practice. And then a short concluding session where I suggest that the garden is an appropriate metaphor for thinking about architectural practice. So let's begin with the concept of Satyagraha, for I believe it to be a largely misunderstood term. If you look up the dictionary, you'll find it associated with the politics of nonviolent civil resistance that Gandhi is known for. And that's most people's understanding of the term. Even Wikipedia, which goes deeper, acknowledging the etymology, still clings to the same definition. But this etymology actually suggests a far deeper meaning, connoting an ongoing and disciplined moral alertness that must continuously work at all moments to sustain anchors in truth. Otherwise, one will keep getting knocked over by destabilizing circumstance. So it's far more than a political strategy. It embraces an entire way of life. And that raises the question of what does one mean by truth? We get some clues on how Gandhi answered this question from his autobiography, particularly this wonderful critical edition with the incisive notes from Tridip Surud. Now, truth is not normally associated with experiments, yet these 2 words are juxtaposed in the title. And it breaks other autobiographical conventions. It is not a singular narrative published as one text. It was published in weekly episodes between 1925 and 1929 in his journal Navjeevan. And some of these installments contain contradictions or factual errors, and they were pointed out to Gandhi, and Gandhi acknowledged them, but he never bothered to correct them or issue retractions. Yet one sensed that he felt that the consistent thread was truth through all this. And that's because to Gandhi, one's body is a sacred site that contains far more than self-centered intention or desire. It is imbued with an antaryami, or a divine spirit within. And Gandhi sought that every thought and action should be shaped by the exhortation of the antaryami. So Satyagraha means the discipline to remain discerningly rooted at all times in the inherent wisdom and compassion of the antaryami. So perceptions and positions might change over time, but one has the consistency with which one is engaged with the antaryami is what matters. So truth is far more than an abstract certainty. It's a dynamic state of being, a consistency of grounded spiritual and moral reckoning. So Satyagraha is actually the discipline of a daily practice that sustains awareness of the antaryami as one's transcendental core and aligns every action and thought with one's antaryami. So this brings me to the second section, which is on consciousness. And this connection was a serendipitous discovery because I had a separate interest in consciousness and I was reading about it and I didn't see any connection with Satyagraha. And then I found some very valuable resonances because Gandhi was in many ways a religious traditionalist. And to him, spiritual faith unmarked by doubt was an a priori starting point. And if you're not a religious traditionalist, which I am not, that is probably problematic. But then I thought if we can find antaryami and satyagraha in the nature of our consciousness, we would need neither a priori faith nor logical persuasion, for we access our consciousness directly from our own experience. So whatever validation we need, we can find within us as a very fact of our existence. So whatever I say in this section, I ask you not to interpret it as an intellectual abstraction. Try and seek the resonance it strikes within your body, either as an experience you have had or as an experiential exploration you can easily envisage doing. So I'm going to share 4 facets of consciousness. And the first is that consciousness is a miracle. And to cite the proof of this miracle, I will quote an eminent man of science, the theoretical physicist Brian Greene, who said, I quote, "My view from the perspective of what we are as physical beings is we are nothing but collections of particles that are fully governed by the laws of physics. Colloquially, we are bags of particles that have a particular organization that allows for certain biological functions to take place. And that's all that we are." Now, some would say, well, if that's your view of who we are, then you have already eliminated any possibility for meaning or value and purpose. You have denigrated the very nature of what it means to be human. And my view is exactly the opposite. My view is the very fact that collections of particles can do the kinds of things that we can do, the fact that you and I can have this conversation, the fact that an Einstein can work out the laws of general relativity, the fact that a Shakespeare can write King Lear, the fact that a Beethoven can compose the Ode to Joy finale to the Ninth Symphony, the fact that particles governed by physical law can do all that, that to me is the wonder of it all. That to me is where it's thrilling. The concept of purpose doesn't come from the universe, it comes from within us. It's invented by us human beings. So our physical bodies, in which every particle is governed by the laws of physics, are somehow imbued with a consciousness that can love, play, create, ideate, dream, feel beauty, dance, and so much more. Science is yet to explain this and perhaps may never get to explaining it. But that does not constrain us, for we intuitively know in our bones the reality and potential of our consciousness. Now, a miracle is something that is wondrous, unquestionably real, and occurring without any apparent explanation of its cause. So our consciousness is a miracle we can revel in. The poet, philosopher, and one-time priest John O'Donohue said, I quote, "One of the sad things today is that so many people are frightened by the wonder of their own presence. They are dying to tie themselves into a system, a role, or to an image, or to a predetermined identity that other people have actually settled on for them." End quote. Now, this fear comes because we have not recognized, not been taught to recognize, and even taught not to recognize the miracle of our consciousness. And consequently, we rely too far on external validation, aligning with a crowd, often conditioned to do so by external orthodoxy, ideology, or politics. But to revel in the miracle of one's consciousness is to celebrate the wonder of one's own presence. And this can be a natural, inborn anchor for dealing with the world. The second facet is that consciousness grants clarity to intangible value. As philosopher Michael Polanyi has pointed out, we always know far more than is our capacity to tell. A lot of our knowledge is tacit as opposed to explicit knowledge which can be said or documented. A prosaic example is riding a bicycle, which can be explained by the laws of physics, but knowing those laws is of no use in learning how to ride a bicycle. It can only be known through embodied memory that is beyond our capacity to describe. And the same also applies to our emotions. And because this tacit knowledge is often equated with emotion, our formal education trains us to believe that it is subjective and capricious, and only objective knowledge is valuable because it is documentable and shareable. But the falsehood of this claim is apparent in significant dimensions of culture, such as music. The master pianist's capacity to play is purely tacit, yet it is recognized as having transcendental value and is shareable to the level that it possesses commercial value. People are willing to pay large sums of money to buy tickets to his performances or to buy his recordings. What is required is that you invest your tacit sensitivities toward mindfully occupying the same space as the knowledge for a duration of time. And that is how this knowledge gets shared. Michael Polanyi argues that the more tacit knowledge is, the more transcendental it is. This applies to our life. If you were to ask someone what makes their life worthwhile, they are likely to name attributes such as these. All attributes will be hard-pressed to define, but we know them as unquestionably real when we experience them. And we experience them both individually and in meaningful moments we spend with each other. We celebrate not just the wonder of our own presence, we celebrate the wonder of other presence. Sadly, we are often impoverished by intellectual or ideological bias that blocks wholehearted embrace of this experiential core. And this experiential core is crucial to our being. Joseph Campbell, the scholar of myth, pointed out, we make a mistake in thinking we seek the meaning of life. What we actually seek is the rapture of being alive. And we find that rapture when we see in something outside us an echo of our innermost being. We find it when we live these kind of values together with the people we care for. We find it when our myth, art, and architecture strike this resonance. The third facet is bringing rigor to consciousness. Philosopher David Chalmers has shaped the scientific investigation of consciousness by pointing out it is both an easy and a hard problem. The easy problem is finding neural correlates to facets of consciousness, and advances in the technology of brain imaging have allowed great advances on this score. The hard problem, where we are barely scratching the surface, is explaining how physical bodies produce qualitative experience. One cannot solve the hard problem through findings from the easy problem, for that would confuse causation with correlation. Now, the hard problem is hard because it seeks an explanation of consciousness from a position outside consciousness, and our daily life precludes such a position. So it would be more productive to explore possibilities within consciousness that impart rigor to it without reliance on scientific explanation. And this approach has a history of over 2 millennia in India and other parts of the East. And I'd like to share 3 promising forms of praxis from this history that have also been personified by Gandhi. The first is sadhana, the Urdu word for it being riyaz. It's a form of practice that is rigorous, repetitive, immersive, and ego-transcending. It still forms the foundation for training in the performing arts and the traditional crafts, finds some recognition in the fine arts, but is largely neglected in other fields. It produces 2 effects. It slowly ingrains a craft into embodied consciousness, increasing the spontaneity of mastery. So the master pianist becomes one with the piano. The master carpenter becomes one with the wood. And consciousness gradually discerns subtle yet transcendental dimensions of the craft. A prime example of this is in music, and there's a powerful story narrated in an interview by the Hindustani classical vocalist Pushkar Lele, who had been learning since a young age, and after learning for 15 years reached a plateau that he could not transcend. So he did what many Indians do in that situation. He changed his guru, and he started learning under Vijay Sardeshmukh. And his initial thought was that the new guru will hand him the keys to this higher realm that he seeks. But the guru pushed him back to basics and said, for the next 6 months, for 8 hours a day, you will sing one note, sa, the first note of the scale. And he found that rather pedantic, but in India you have to do what the guru tells you to do. So he sang sa. And he said one day he sang the sa that his guru was waiting to hear. And he saw his guru smile. And he realized until that day he had not hit the exact center of a note before. And I was curious about the lineage of this epiphany. And I found that Lele's guru was Sardeshmukh. Sardeshmukh's guru was Kumar Gandharva. And one of Kumar Gandharva's gurus, very early in his career, was amazingly, for that time, a woman called Anjanibai Malpekar. And there's an interview of Kumar Gandharva where he narrates something that Anjanibai Malpekar taught him. And she said, you start with one note, and your sadhana will reveal to you an entire octave within that note. It is actually in these very refined subtleties that greatness begins. You take the example of 2 musicians, both professionally trained. One is good, the other is truly great. You cannot fault the good one on any technicality like tunefulness or adherence to the composition. But it's in these subtle changes in microtone and timing that the great one leaves the good behind and breaks into a completely new magical realm. Gandhi embodied 2 forms of sadhana, both unusual for a person in politics, generally known more as a doer than a thinker. One is that he meditated every day, and most famously remarked once, I have so much to do today, I had better meditate for 2 hours instead of 1. And the other was writing was a form of daily reflective rigor. And he accumulated an oeuvre of such depth and diversity that his collected writings assembled after his death were categorized into 98 volumes. The second is the second form of praxis is the 4 paths defined by Hindu tradition that spiritual sadhana can take, best explained by Swami Vivekananda in his writing on the 4 yogas. The word yoga means discipline here. The first is bhakti, predicated on faith and surrender, primarily practiced through prayer, ritual, music, poetry, and dance. Karma Yoga centers on work, but dedicating work to a greater cause without selfish attachment to the fruits of the work. Raj Yoga increases mindfulness through meditative awareness, and Jnana Yoga extends one's being through knowledge. The relative emphasis on each of these yogas varies from person to person. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And Gandhi echoed this when he said, "The paths are many, the truth is one." The third mode is laid out in a text from the 2nd century BCE, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And Patanjali talks about Ashtanga, which means 8 limbs of yoga, that lay out a path of spiritual discovery. The first 2 limbs clear the ground for the rest. Yama, a set of ethical rules, and Niyama, a set of virtuous habits. And then the body comes into the picture through asana, or posture, which is self-aware, alert, relaxed, and steady. Then the body starts tuning into the energy around it, and prana, or breath, as the energy that ebbs and flows inside your body, sustaining you, is the primary form that the body can use. Then pratyahara, which draws awareness and energy inward. Moving on to dharana, or one-pointed attention. And then dhyana, which is where dharana contemplates the transcendental infinite. And the ultimate goal is samadhi, or union with the transcendental infinite. Now, Gandhi never explicitly cited Patanjali, but he did personify the ethical rules and virtuous habits of Yama and Niyama. And he was initiated by one of India's foremost yogis, Paramahamsa Yogananda, into Kriya, which is a meditative practice that does call upon the Ashtanga. Now, Kriya is something you're just supposed to do and not talk about, because talking is a distraction. And so Gandhi never spoke or wrote about it. But Yogananda was once asked some years later, "Do you believe Gandhi is practicing Kriya?" And he said, "Gandhi gave me his word he would. I believe he is a man of his word, so yes, I do believe he is practicing Kriya." The fourth facet of consciousness I talk about is wonder, and a form of consciousness called lantern consciousness. We know our brains are structured into 2 hemispheres, and it was long believed they specialized by subject: an analytical left brain dealing with language and logic, and a creative right brain dealing with image and metaphor. This belief still survives in popular imagination, but has long been debunked by neuroscience. It is now established that all subjects call on the participation of both hemispheres, but each hemisphere pays attention in different ways. They hold a creative tension between an attention to detail and an attention to context. And this has a very long evolutionary history. Back when we were hunter-gatherers, we needed an attention to detail to focus on and find or gather food. But we needed an attention to context to be aware of predators. Attention to detail is unidirectional, seeking to manipulate the world. Awareness of context is multidirectional, accentuating our immersion in the world. Cognitive scientist Alison Gopnik defines these 2 modes of attention as lantern consciousness and spotlight consciousness. The spotlight's narrow beam is on detail. The lantern seeks to throw as much light as possible on context. Now, children are naturals in lantern consciousness and consequently rooted in curiosity, wonder, and play. And this happens largely because of 2 reasons. First, the protective security of caregivers empowers a playfulness by deflecting pressure to deploy the spotlight. They don't need to manage the world. The caregivers do that. And we find this in many other species who exhibit an intelligence we empathize with. Elephants, dolphins, crows, chimpanzees, dogs, cats, all have relatively long periods of nurturing their young. Compared to other species, chickens, for example, where the chick has to fend itself very soon after emerging from the egg. The second thing in humans is that the prefrontal cortex, often called the executive brain, that processes decisions, sequences, logical connections, matures slower than the rest of the brain and catches up only in adolescence. For reasons I don't have the time to go into, we tend to succumb as adults to domination by the spotlight. But this is avoidable. Bringing rigor to consciousness trains lantern consciousness. Sadhana, the 4 yogas, Ashtanga Yoga, are modes of practice to stay rooted in wonder and connected to the magic in the world. So if we look at these 4 facets of consciousness, the miracle of consciousness and its grasp of the intangible evokes the Antaryami. And making consciousness rigorous to sustain wonder evokes the practice of Satyagraha. So I come now to how it's relevant to architectural practice. And our consciousness encounters the world at 3 levels. There is our first-person experience where we know our consciousness. And there is a world out there we can connect with through our senses, and we share this perception with many others. We'll call it a third-person account, and we call this reality. But in our daily practice, there's an intermediate level of second-person mediation where we conversationally connect with someone or something outside us. And this is a primordial means of engagement. Now we can connect this with architecture. The seminal texts, the built works, we can say are our reality, our third-person account. The architect as an individual represents first-person experience, and the modes of practice represent second-person mediation. But because our education trains us in this bias towards documented reality, we don't know how to encounter first-person consciousness into it. Only the image of the architect stays there as a personality. And then we don't even know how to bring the modes of practice into it. And so we are left with this very partial account that we call reality. We have to hold all 3 levels together and realize that they're embedded within cultural and natural networks of practice. We know the authenticity of our own consciousness, the wonder of our own presence, but we validate it through the resonance we find through our engagement with others and the world around us. And then we reify this validation. Reification is a process of making something concrete that represents something intangible. And the stories, art, and architecture we make are crucial modes of reification. They offer sites of exactitude that resist the mess of everyday life. The intentions of the artist or any claim of meaning inherent to the work are irrelevant. What matters is how reification offers sites of refuge that allow us to take a measure of who we are. Continuously moving across all 3 levels is crucial to any authenticity we may feel in our lives. Third-person accounts will be pointless abstractions, or even worse, modes of ideological persuasion, if they do not resonate with the wonder of the presence of first-person experience, validated through second-person mediation. And first-person experience can turn self-indulgent if it is not validated by second-person mediation and incapable of reification into third-person account. To connect this to the act of design, Joseph Rickwert offers the powerful suggestion that we view design as an act of translation, because architects deal with 2 languages. There's a language of design process which is deployed in their office, which depends on ideas, drawings, sketches, models, digital simulations. But afterwards, the built work relies on the language of spatial inhabitation, which has a very different vocabulary of embodied immersion, sensory experience, the full range of consciousness, plays out over time, gets absorbed into memory. So given these 2 different vocabularies, design can be viewed as an act of translation from the language of design process to the language of inhabitation. But then Rickwert makes a significant point. He says in translation, we need a far greater fluency in the language we are translating into than the language we are translating from. If I am to translate a poem from English into Hindi, I need enough English to understand and appreciate the poem with all its nuance. But I need to be a masterful poet in Hindi. This is not the way architects are trained. We tend to misplace our attention prioritizing fluency in design process, and this is exacerbated by the inward turn toward peer review. We should prioritize our fluency in spatial inhabitation, and this is best explored and validated through the practice of Satyagraha, because to inhabit space is a basic human tendency, and this is how we explore what it means to be human. And this is what we must do before we attempt anything else in our practice. So one could ask, how can architectural design be conducive to translation? The language of design process. I'll offer 8 proposals on spatial pattern, not a comprehensive list, but suggestive of an approach. The first is mental mapping. We are always inside architectural space, so we can never see it in its entirety. The space must have qualities of enclosure and scale by which it can be conceptualized in our minds and in a way that's friendly to the inhabiting body. And this needs to apply to a single space or a conglomeration of spaces. The second is peripheral vision. Architects tend to privilege focused vision. As Juhani Pallasmaa, the renowned architect and theorist, has observed, focused vision sets up a distance between spectator and object, whereas peripheral vision immerses us within space. So we must go beyond the precise delineation of form that focused vision privileges, and also attend to the gradations of scaled and textured enclosure that support peripheral vision. Ambiguity, a word that should be differentiated from vagueness, for it does not imply a fogged perception, but an offering of a multiplicity of choices, each one precise. Even simple designs can be layered to empower multiple perceptions and experience, as shown by this analysis of the plan of the tomb of Ahmed Shah in Ahmedabad. Or this doorway in Tughlakabad, which marks out a series of doorways, each appropriate to a scale from which it is viewed. Each nest, so the largest doorway maybe is worth seeing, it works best when seen from 100 meters. Then you come in and there's a doorway within it that reveals itself, and then one more within it. And finally, the door you actually pass through, you can say, oh, that's about 3 people high. It's scaled to the human body. Stillness, crafting the detail and the whole to resonate with the same spirit. So whichever way the gaze or body moves, the same spirit manifests, evoking stillness. Liminal spaces such as verandas, bay windows, niches, thresholds that lie in between primary spaces to offer a presence that resists the compulsions of time and purpose that often overwhelm primary space. Unboundedness. How does one evoke infinity when one's intervention is confined to a single project? Using the work of Jeffrey Bawa, I propose 5 possibilities. Opening up to vista, interlocking layers, the courtyard interlocks with the front room with the front veranda with the front yard with the street with the neighborhood, and so on. Lining the edge of the project with nature, or with light, or rescaling depth. Experience maps. How does one label the spaces of a design? We tend to use functional labels like living room and dining room, and therefore we make function maps. But suppose we saw our plans as experience maps, and instead of functional labels, we sought to use poetic experiential labels. So instead of living room, a place for convivial gathering filled with delight, color, and memory, but able to transform into a nourishing shelter for solitude. Instead of dining room, a joyous place for rhythmic familial bonding, circling to face inward toward each other, amplified with the sensory delight of food. Prioritizing poetic experience will prompt radically different design choices. And then embedding memory, because inhabitation plays out over time to breed memories that are absorbed into the grain of the space in which they are created. The writer Primo Levi writes an essay on his own home and starts off talking about a technique used by the orators of ancient Rome who had to remember long, complex speeches without paper for everyday notes, an aid we take for granted these days. And what they did was they used the architecture of the place where they were going to make the speech as a mnemonic device, where they would go in and say the door stands for the first point, the column next to it for the second point, the niche next to it for the third point, etc. And Levi says, I could never use this technique in my own home, for every corner is already occupied by authentic memories which would interfere with the fictitious ones this technique demands. So when we occupy a space over time, memories get embedded into it, and then we can read those memories in that space. If you were to remember your childhood, you're better served by remembering the house you grew up in than by looking at the family photo album, because the photo album only captures the tangible memories. This image is from Jeffrey Bawa's Colombo house, and I had the privilege of visiting this house along with Juhani Palasma. And he made an interesting observation. He said that Bawa was clearly very fond of chairs, because there's something like 40 to 50 different chair designs, and they're all aesthetically very different. Yet they don't clash, they seem to fuse under this air of lived life. And that's because they might be aesthetically different, but clearly Bawa had equal affection for them all. And therefore things merge together that way. So if we design for memory our choice of material, scale, texture, space, etc., will start being very different, because it seeks to become sticky to memory. So my conclusion, which is a short conclusion, is only 2 slides. Satyagraha seeks connection with the intangible and demands surrender to greater reality. So practice that is founded on Satyagraha is not a place amenable to detailed control. It is like a garden that can at best be nurtured through small daily acts of love in a quest to align its authenticity with our own, where the consequences of each act go into shaping the next act. The revelations of Satyagraha and their translation are neither rapid nor linear. They must be gradually absorbed into our consciousness, with much forbearance needed for consequent mastery and emergence of the poetic. This is captured most eloquently in the soul prose work of the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke, when he said, "And still, it is not enough to have memories. One must be able to forget them when they are many, and one must have the great patience to wait until they come again. For it is not yet the memories themselves. Not until they have turned to blood within us, to glance, to gesture, nameless and no longer to be distinguished from ourselves. Not until then can it happen that in a most rare hour, the first word of a verse arises in their midst and goes forth from them." Thank you.
So the first question, of course, is when is C and T going to settle down in Lalbagh?
In Lalbagh, we have a garden where we are. We don't have to go anywhere. And being married to a landscape architect helps.
I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone here, but I think I'm going to give it a bit of a shot, Prem. One of the important things I think that you have written in your larger write-up is how Gandhi was seriously against the Western idea of enlightenment. And I think you've demonstrated very well, and thank you for that talk. That there are serious questions to be asked for enlightenment as one overarching kind of things. I come from the Netherlands, so from that perspective, perhaps Western enlightenment is not one, because if you ask the French, or you ask the Scandinavians, or you ask the Anglo-Saxons, it seems that the resentment of Gandhi was very much against the Anglo-Saxon version of enlightenment. If you look at a few people who are part of the history of education, Rudolf Steiner, our own Rabindranath Tagore, Maria Montessori, Jiddu Krishnamurti, I think in their own ways they have been able, with quite a bit of success, to maybe go about, well, maybe to leapfrog the idea of, let's say, the West and the East. And I'm just wondering, in your talk, I think what is very clear is that something needs to change in education. And if you look at architectural education, and I see students from Mysore, I see former students from SPA, could you say something about perhaps that our profession could have grown in a different direction if we had listened more or less to one of the persons I have mentioned?
Certainly, and actually there's some small twists of history that make a huge difference, because design education is immensely shaped by the Bauhaus. And in the early founding years of the Bauhaus, there was a great tussle between a theosophist school influenced by Steiner and the rationalist school which Walter Gropius was driving. And unfortunately, the Gropius faction won. So if the other faction had won, probably design education would be completely different now. And Steiner's viewpoint was that the architect does not take an idea and convert it into a form. He manages form to release the potential of the idea contained within it by understanding the spiritual content of reality. So definitely there are a lot of strains in European thought also, which, I mean, I would agree with you, you can't put it all into one bucket.
Let's park the Anglo-Saxons in the corner.
Yeah. But generally, I think there's a phrase which is attributed to Socrates, but apparently he didn't say it, is that education is kindling a flame, not filling a vessel. And unfortunately, most of our education is based on the filling a vessel concept. And I had an experience that really taught me what education should really be about. My first job out of architecture school was working for this architect called Murad Chaudhry, who had just stopped teaching. And he was talking to me one day about his experience as a teacher. And he said, I can't teach architecture because architecture is not teachable in that sense. But I can go into the architecture school and communicate my passion for architecture. And if the student gets infected by that passion, that student will learn architecture. And it's actually that pedagogic spark of connection in the classroom, in the studio, that matters. So I think that's very much, tied into Gandhi's notion of the antaryami. You are trying to evoke the antaryami of the student to spark, to flower. But we tend to treat the students as passive vessels.
Some of us do.
I'm talking about the system as a gender.
Yeah. No, I get that. I get it. But we're challenging the system, right? Building on that, perhaps Gropius at some stage won, or Bauhaus became the most important kind of reference school. But he also ended up in serious trouble because they had Mr. Adolf coming along, right? So if you look at the Indian context, I sometimes wish that one of my big heroes, Tagore, that he had really embraced architecture, because he was so talented. He is. I mean, where to start? In literature, in poetry, in performing arts, it's. I mean, but Tagore and architecture, as an educationist, and that also means that the Britishers. This is going to be a good British bashing evening, guys. Anybody with family in Britain? They did not allow, for a very long period of time, people from India to study architecture, right? Because the architect should be a white person, and most probably at that time a white guy. 40 years ago, we ended up with 25 schools of architecture. And that has kind of ballooned into 500 plus today. What would have happened if Tagore and perhaps a few more personages would have really embraced architecture? Because even with Gandhi, and this is a little bit a slippery slope that I'm treading on, what if Gandhi would have completely embraced architecture as he did with so many other thoughts in terms of self-sustainability, and as a part of getting rid of colonialism?
I don't know, that's a big question. I don't know what would have happened if Tagore had embraced architecture. It's very difficult to forecast, because, where would he have just been one island and the rest of the system around him being very different? That's also possible, because the whole policy on education was very different. So I don't know if he would have shaped it. And Gandhi, you got to remember, he's an amazing person, and there's so much value in his work, but he's also problematic in many ways. And the way he over-romanticized the village, and almost, to the point of actually supporting the Varna system of caste. And so I don't know, if he had embraced architecture, it's a bit more of a shaky question.
Got it. You mentioned very clearly three points in your reading. One is the moral code for life. The second one is that the Satyagraha also informs politics and other fields. And the third one is to look at the nature of human consciousness. You have spoken very candidly about it, and thank you, because I understand much better where you're coming from than if I read the initial kind of introductions. So if we go towards design as an act of translation, the process and the experience. Are there, in your mind, successful examples, known or well or not known at all, under the radar, in South Asia, where you would say, I have discovered it recently. You told me that about a year ago you started to really think about this conceptual idea. Do you feel that there have been others? And I mentioned South Asia, but please feel free to, I mean, I'm just going to give one name, Hassan Fatih, Architecture for the Poor, Egypt. One name that immediately came to my mind when you talked about this, when you asked me to be here. Are there others where you feel have already been able to establish some sort of momentum, if I may say?
Yeah, definitely. And Hassan Fatih is, I think, a largely misunderstood figure. He's treated more like an ideological figure, talking about who the architect should serve and all that, which definitely was a strong part of him. But he was also a marvelous architect. I mean, you could look at a building of his and say, this is a wonderful building, whether it's designed for a poor person or not. I'd say someone like Jeffrey Bava also, who actually hated talking about architecture. He just wanted to do it. And I'll tell you an interesting story which kind of resonates with what I've been talking about. A classmate of mine from architecture school, 1 year out of architecture school, got a job with Jeffrey Bava. And Bava was at that time designing the Sri Lankan Parliament building, which was the largest project he'd ever undertaken. And he needed to hire architects, and he wasn't getting enough in applications in Sri Lanka, so he was hiring from India also. So he was supposed to go to Chennai to conduct interviews. And at the last moment, he couldn't go because some emergency came up. So he told my friend, you go and interview people. So my friend was psyched. I mean, here he's 1 year out of architecture school, and he's supposed to go and hire staff for this master architect. And he said, no, I can't do that. And Bava said to him, it's quite simple. I like you, so if you like someone, the odds are I like them too. And you go there and you talk to them about anything, even if it's about cricket. And if you find you can strike a rapport with them, it means there's something good in that person. Then all we have to do is bring that person here, find out what that good thing is, and get him to do it. So I mean, that's a completely sort of radical kind of approach, and it's sort of based on human connections. It's about being part of a family. It's talking about the resonance we find in each other. It's actually building on your consciousness. And he would always do these things, like if he was asked a question like how high should this railing should be, he'd just hold his hand and say this high. And his staff would want a more precise answer, saying so many centimeters. So they'd ask for that precise answer, and he'd say, okay, I'll hold my hand, you measure it. So it's a very different mode of working.
Have you met Jeffrey Bava?
No, I mean, I've seen him from a distance, but I've never had the chance to talk to him.
For me, it's the first time that I connect Jeffrey Bava with a Gandhian approach towards architecture. I always thought he was a very spoiled brat, driving around in his Rolls Royce, sipping his gin tonic, and then saying, I actually think that hill needs to go, it's spoiling my view.
But sometimes even spoiled brats do some good work.
I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Bava. Other examples. She's not there anymore, but she used to be in the Himalayas. DD Contractor, I'm just going to mention a few names, and I would like you to respond. Chitra, Vishwanath, here, present. Neelam, Manjunath, not present, I think. And then, of course, the obvious one, Laurie Baker. Aldo van Eyck. I'll leave it for now.
Van Eyck was different because from the others that you mentioned, because the others worked on that instinctive, intuitive way, actually being on site, doing a lot themselves, being involved with the construction process. Van Eyck was also a theorist. He wrote, so he was reflective. But he was a theorist not in the high theory, ivory tower sense. He was a theorist in a very empirical sense based on a very close observation of how people behave. But it's basically, I think that's a mode of working where you don't step back. That's a mistake many of us get into in architecture school, where we believe one must first construct a theory and then we must go and apply it in practice. And I think it is actually more valuable to think of practice and theory as fighting each other very productively. That practice is a way of critiquing theory, theory is a way of critiquing practice. And then it's a day-to-day evolution that happens. And I think all those figures worked in that way, even if Van Eyck wrote about it, and the others didn't. But they every daily experience, they got into that experience with authenticity, and then they reflected on that experience. And then they built on it one day at a time. And in that light, I'd like to tell a lovely story about Gandhi that I think illustrates this mode of working. And this was...
If you come back to the question, that's okay.
Yeah, I will. This is a story I heard narrated by the poet and critic Ashok Vajpayee. And it's a beautiful story, but Vajpayee took it to another level by some comments he made. And this is on the Dundee Salt March. And Gandhi and about 60 others are marching, and they reach a river they need to cross. Well, river is perhaps too big a word. It was something you could wade across. But at that moment in time, the water level was a little too high. And there's this village on the bank of the river, and they say that by midnight, the tidal levels will drop the water level and it'll be easy to walk across. And so they vacated their huts, and Gandhi and the marchers were resting. And meanwhile, the villagers were talking, what will these great people do when they come out at midnight? And when they emerged, they found that to aid them in crossing that river in the darkness of midnight, the villagers were in a line extending into the river, each one holding a diya. And they only had to cross half the river because the village on the other side had heard about it, and they covered their half of the river with their line of diyas. And as I said, that's a beautiful story, but Ashok Vajpayee took it to a different level. And he said, when we try to think of role models we can emulate, we'd probably find it impossible to be like Gandhi. People like individuals like that are very rare. We would also find it hard to be like the marchers who were going with him, who gave up, put their lives and livelihood on pause, knowing that they risk bringing the wrath of empire on their head. But what we can be is like those villagers who recognized something special was passing through their life and sought to shine a little light on it. And I think that's another mode of working, and I think the people you're talking about, like Didi Contractor and Laurie Baker, and to me, they're people who work that way. They got very engaged with life authentically as they lived, as they experienced. And if they saw something special, they sought to shine some light on it and carry that forward to the next day. And as you carry these little things forward one day at a time, it can accumulate to something quite powerful, which is not the way we're taught to be as architects.
So it's important to de-learn.
To?
To de-learn.
Yes.
Good.
Well, de-learn in the sense, get rid of your biases. Just be open authentically to the experiences you face every day.
And I think, rigor, or Baker was also very much about practice, practice, practice. And basically, from a Methodist, he became a Quaker. And I think wherever the drive comes from, he always worked. So I think the discipline of practicing and not thinking too much about, clients or the what you called very nicely the day-to-day business kind of things, but just doing it. In that sense, M.F. Hussein, who kept on drawing, kept on painting, kept on giving it away, very different than, let's say, some other painters who were very self-aware of the potential value of their art. Okay, let's move on to, I'm just looking at the time.
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? Great. Frugality. Frugality has become a more and more important word in architecture. And if I try to look at you, Prem, as a person who is part of the act of creation, part of trying to create evidence that architecture can be meaningful. Also, maybe looking at your own amazing record of once upon a time, you met some students from SPA, and I said that he studied at SPA a few years back. Had it change who you were in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s? I'm thinking of Hermann Hesberger, who was a very different architect in his 30s as in his 50s and his 70s. The ability to change. Then you mentioned stillness. How do you design stillness in seriously loud urban kind of projects that demand visibility and things like that? So maybe you could share a bit about how do you create? Start maybe to say what do you create? What do you create as evidence of, are you still finding out what that kind of path should be?
Well, one is continuously trying to find out what that path should be, but I'll tell you some of the key points one has tried to integrate into one's practice. One is the thing that I think a bias that's created in us by the nature of our education is to believe that we put meaning into the work, that our intentions matter. And I think that comes because in school we are always next to our work talking about it. We are presenting it in a studio grid, we are defending it to a jury, etc. And that voice of the architect is sustained by the mechanism of peer review once you graduate. But actually, after you graduate and you start thinking about practicing and you complete a building and you hand it over for inhabitation, you disappear from the scene. There's a perpetual silence of the architect once a building is built. And to come to terms with that moment of silence is not something we are trained to do. So I think there's a pattern of inhabitation that breeds memory and breeds meaning over time. And I've written an essay about it where I say that we are trained in an aesthetics of expression. What do we wish to say? But what we should be designing for is an aesthetic of absorption. How do you create this site that people can then appropriate and inhabit in a way that, that will provoke interesting stories that they value about how they lived in that space. And then I wrote this essay on the aesthetics of absorption, I think in 1994. And then I thought I've cracked it, and I found I hadn't. And it's sort of incredibly difficult. And the thing that I struggled with quite a long time was that one needs to maintain one's disciplinary autonomy, otherwise the profession of architecture has no meaning. There's something special we should be doing, so the autonomy of the discipline has to be there. And one also needs to connect with the processes of life, the primordial processes of life, and that took quite a struggle to figure out. And the methodology we use in our practice is to try and connect two words which we use in a very specific way, and we say proposition and diagram. That every project has to have a proposition which is an aspirational statement about life. It's not about architecture. And then the diagram is where our professional autonomy comes in, and the diagram is an order of space. And our challenge is, how do we create a diagram that encapsulates the proposition? So one starts thinking differently that way when you do it. Like if we're designing a college, we start talking about a community of learners, where learning is an activity that has to pervade every space, not just the classroom. Even the corridor, you step out. Because think about it in college, you stepped out of a class and you immediately struck up a conversation with someone about it. Maybe to complain about it, but whatever it is. But that was also a mode of learning. So learning is also all these informal things. So we try and think about how every space can breed this community of learners, where even the teacher is a learner. So it's in modes like this to try and create the framework of something that then breeds meaning over time. And if you do that, then you are driven towards, a little bit towards notions of frugality, because if you're designing for expression, you're trying to say, I do something for show. But if you're trying to design in a way that that it's friendly to someone saying, yes, I like this is mine, then you're not talking about show, you go to something else.
So practically, does that mean that if you're not able to find this methodology of proposition and diagramming, and you find that there is not enough meaningfulness in the project, do you stop the project? Do you say no if you feel that there is not enough possibilities for you as a creator? Or can we expect in the future that the oeuvre of CNT will change?
No, I don't think it will change that rapidly, because we're trying to look at things that have a sort of duration over time, which it's a slow process. So now, having said that, I mean, it's a balancing act, because one is not trying to immediately say, oh, if there's a difficulty, I will withdraw or something. One is trying to persist in the dialogue, because obviously you're going to meet people who think very differently from you, and you have to engage with them, not look down on them. And this was something we were inculcated in by the previous generation of the practice. We were always taught, when you're presenting a design, don't say I think, say don't you think. Because if you say I think, it becomes my possession. If you say don't you think, it becomes something greater than any one individual in the room. So one has to sort of persist with that kind of a dialogue. But there are times at which we find that for whatever reason the dialogue is just not working and it's not productive and we can't do anything. And yes, in those cases we step out of the project. We were given a commission to design a 56-acre university campus. We are supposed to do not just the master plan but all the buildings, and we did the master plan and we did a couple of buildings, but then for various reasons it came out that it was not sustainable, and then we had to have a frank conversation with the client saying, I think it's better if we just agree to disagree and part ways. So obviously one doesn't do it if one has to stick to the, what is your core of the way you work.
Sure. No, but let's say if I talk about the choice
I think we need to open it up to questions.
Yes, the choice for materiality. We had 40 years of IAM here in the same platform. Different speakers talking about their designs and their etc. And afterwards we had a discussion with the director of IAM and Mohe and a few more people. Bijoy was there. And I just said, I understand that once upon a time the Doshi, because his guru loves concrete, is Mr. Concrete. So obviously Doshi had a profound love for concrete. But if in 2024, if you are getting a commission for IAM to design a 3 or 4 story building, do you still need to stick to that material? Or perhaps this is would you like to be part of a different kind of future for the architecture?
There's no very general answer to that question. It would depend on which the project was and what you were doing.
Okay, let's open it up. I see some questions. Sonali?
Yes, thanks, Anna. I just have a very general question, which is that I look at the burgeoning, I'll just use the word ugliness architecturally around us, both in material, in design, in use, all around. And obviously this, it seems to be so thoughtless, honestly. And we know that, for example, construction is, I think, responsible for maybe 14% of climate emissions.
Yeah, 38.
Oh, it's 38. Oh, 47. Oh, there we go. Okay. So let's say 50%.
It's a lot.
And so much of it is it necessary? What's going on? And can you have some input into architectural education with that eye? And my other question is, I'm not sure if you can answer it, is more a comment, which is that I think Indians, we have this amazing textile, amazing all of that, which seems to have aesthetics around those things. But somehow architecturally, we don't seem to have demanded light and air and living quality in our buildings, either again in the material or in the actual when you inhabit. What's up with that, if those are intelligible questions?
Well, that's a huge question, which even if I gave another 35-minute lecture, I think I wouldn't be able to cover it adequately. I'll give you, I'll sort of skirt around it and do the best I can, but recently there was a Supreme Court judgment against a case brought by the Council of Architecture, which is the regulatory body that regulates architecture. And the council wanted to say that only architects, qualified architects, should be allowed to do architecture. Because actually only about 10% of construction is handled by architects, maybe less than that. A lot of it happens outside the profession. And the Supreme Court said that, and the council was saying that's the only way of ensuring a quality of construction. And the Supreme Court actually struck that case. The judgment didn't favor the council. They said the title of architect is protected, but not the practice. Anyone can practice architecture. And I became rather unpopular by supporting that judgment, because that I felt what the case the council and the Indian Institute of Architects and all were making was actually protectionism, which would breed mediocrity. And I said there's a more profound problem with qualified architects who are doing bad architecture. And that's to do with the quality of our education system. It's a very complex subject. Tied to that is the problem that in India we don't have an imagination of the city. We place culture in the village, but the city is seen as a technical entity, not as a cultural entity. And our building codes are not designed to create a specificity of neighborhoods, of a quality of life. Our building bylaws are all mathematical formulae. It was only the 2017 master plan of Bangalore that recognized the topography of Bangalore. Earlier master plans treated it like a flat plane. So we tend to have this very poor imagination of the city, and the crafts that are more rooted in the village have survived better, but not in the city. So the mode of production of buildings in the city is also different, is problematic, the way we plan our cities. And that's a huge and burning crisis, because we are an urbanizing society. We're going to cross the 50% urban threshold sometime in the middle of this century. So, well, I don't want to go on. Maybe we should have a conversation about it one day. But it's a very valid question, but it's a very complex thing.
I'm continuing with
Sure.
the COA argument, as well as what Anna was saying. Why didn't Rabindranath Tagore or Gandhi, got into architecture? But what I'm saying is that I don't think till then there was this architecture with capital A. Like even the Doma was designed by a jeweler. So everybody could build, and people had a sense of building. So you really don't need this capital A architecture at all. So asking whether Tagore or Gandhi, I don't think they ever thought, because still if you see Vardha Ashram of Gandhi's, it's amazing in terms of its detail and the whole design itself. So it's just a comment, not. Thanks.
There was a nice cartoon I saw once of this very modernist house, and there's this woebegone child looking up at the mother, and the mother is saying, "The last time I saw your teddy bear, it was where the dining area flows into the living area." So I think we architects often develop this sort of, I talked about it, that inward turn, that self-referential turn. So I don't think it's just architecture with a capital A. I think it's architects only talking to architects. That's also the problem.
So I'm going to go back. Thank you, Prem. So thought-provoking, as always. I'm going to go back to your earlier sort of discussions about Gandhi's practices and consciousness, in a way. And I guess one of the things I was thinking was, you said the thing that's missing among all of us is the idea of the miracle and the wonder of self in one's place, I suppose. And but I feel that creativity and immersion, a deep immersion in creativity, actually brings that to the fore. And I just wondered, since architecture is one of those practices that bridges art and aesthetic, but also the pragmatic, as you know, you've been discussing. So where does that play in this arc? You know, I was talking just as an anecdote to Malvika Sarukai once, the dancer, and she was talking about the idea of wonder and how she brings it into her art. And you know, that's an immersion that's very specific and directed, but also grows from within. So I just wondered your comment about, you know.
I think eventually creativity is, because that authenticity of your own experiences is an authenticity that no one else will know, and that's the authenticity with which you feel life. And then you try and see how it echoes with people and things around you, and that sort of back and forth. But it's actually sustaining that sense of wonder that is important. That we tend to jump too quickly to certainty, to the claim that we know it all, and that is where the problem is in our modes of working. And it's really the sort of you know, the delight of finding something and showing it to someone, and before you can even explain it, seeing the light in their eyes. It's those kind of things that are crucial to creativity. And it's often seen as something we have to hide, we have to appear objective. But actually, if we could let it out, it is actually not just good for our creativity, I think it's good for our business also, because I think a client or anyone you're doing work for is likely to trust you the most when they see that you are internally moved by something that sets a bar higher than they could set for you. And I had a client once who was, we were designing a house for her, and she was very nervous because it was a large house, and she said, I'd get nervous, and then I'd see you come to the site, and you'd get out of the car and look at the house, and this goofy expression would come on your face, and then I felt better. So I think it's letting those kind of things out that really matter. I think the clash between the pragmatic and the aesthetic, the technical and the creative, I think is a false division.
So definitely more lantern and less spotlight.
Yeah.
Right? More questions?
May I? So thank you, Mr. Prem, for that enlightening. I am possibly in a room where I do not belong, so I am creating my spaces or developing my intellect that way. I am a lover of architecture. I'm not a formal student of architecture. So my question, and I'm very new to the space of Bangalore, and I've created a home for myself over here after. So I look around, I go around in the lanes, and I see that what you said about creating experiential spaces or spaces that imbues of life or imbues of memory, I believe is a parameter of privilege. It does not imbibe the principles of Gandhian philosophies of inclusion, because I believe it's not affordable and accessible to all the underrepresented classes. They are more drawn towards functional aspects than experiential. We have seen that experientials becomes accessible only to the certain class of the society. So how do we, both as individuals and as a society, or who is really the onus on to create these spaces which are inclusive, experiential, makes you feel alive, even for the underrepresented or not so privileged classes as well? So that's my question.
I don't agree that it's a question of privilege. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. And I think this has come from another thing in our education, which tends to train us towards this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There are the basic needs, and then art and aesthetics is, higher up in the pyramid. And we've come to treat art as a luxury. And therefore we put, at least in the fine arts, we put it in rarefied worlds like the museum and the gallery. But actually it's the people whose struggle for survival is most precarious who are most embedded in art.
They become the subjects of the art.
No, they're not the subjects, they're also the creators and the users. Octavio Paz has a wonderful way of putting it. He said, they don't separate objects of use and objects of contemplation. And so, even if they make a clay pot, they will decorate it with some line around it. They will, we face it in our privileged urban lives, that if you want a kollam or rangoli to be drawn for Diwali, it's unlikely that someone from our family will know how to do it. We usually ask the maidservant to do it. So, and the reason they do it is because to them, their art is a way of making sense of the universe they inhabit. The rangoli is actually a cosmic pattern in which so they don't separate you. We live these very partial existences where we believe reality will be explained by the scientist. So the way of actually using art as a very day-to-day life is of understanding who we are is something we have lost. But the people who struggle for survival, who don't have our privilege, they still need to do it. Yes, in certain circumstances, they're displaced from the ability to do it. So the average slum dweller probably finds it hard to do it. But the slum dweller finds it hard to do it not because they don't have the means to do it, but because they're very vulnerable, because they live on land that they can be dispossessed any time. It has been found that in a slum, people say they can't afford to improve their houses. They can, it's just they can't afford to build a whole house in one shot. They improve it a little bit at a time. But you give a slum security of tenure and the material conditions of the slum improve drastically without any intervention. So I think it is, I don't agree at all that it is actually a matter of privilege. I think you go into our villages and you go into tribal societies. If they make a coconut scraper, they will make it like in the shape of an elephant and tie it into their mythology. They're very embedded in art. Art is not, it's we who have distorted it to think of art as a privilege and a luxury.
I think we'll take it up after this over a cup of tea. There's a question here.
Yeah, hi Prem. Hi. I have been observing that the architecture has evolved from someone being a master mason in the beginning, and then it evolved and it divided into more specific tasks like construction, engineering, drawing, architecture. So this distance has probably some impact on why the architectural practice is also reducing, because I think the current percentage in India is 3% of the buildings are designed and supervised by an architect, all of them. It used to be 5% when I entered the field 20 years ago. So now with the introduction of AutoCAD and computers and generative AI, we are further distancing ourselves from the finished product. So would you say maybe one way to fight back a little bit of that connection would be to go back to drawing with a pencil and introduce that as a must in the education system? Thank you.
Yes. There are several reasons for that. One is that it's not, we don't just think with our brains, we think with our gut, we think with our muscles, we have muscle memory. And drawing by hand, if I do that, I create muscle memory. The short repetitive movements of using a computer don't breed muscle memory. So you develop a way of thinking. Ioannis Palasma has written a book about it, wonderfully titled The Thinking Hand. It's not just your brain, your hand also learns how to think. Second is, given that each one of us is unique and has the authenticity of our own experience, which is not replicated by anyone else, that becomes crucial to our mode of discovery. When I'm drawing by hand, the line I draw is different from anyone else's line. The computer reduces everyone's line to the same. A third thing is when I draw the paper as a fixed space and I develop a sense of scale. One of the arguments I often have with the youngsters in my office, they'll want to show me something on a screen and they'll keep zooming in and out while I'm talking to them. And I say, no, wait. And so that idea of a fixed scale and all of that is important. And then fourth, there's actually a wonderful essay by a structural engineer called Robert Silman. It's called Thinking in Approximations. And he's someone who started his career in the 1960s. He's still working, but he did the restoration of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And he said the use of computers was unknown. And they use a device, for calculation they used a device called a slide rule. I think half the people in this room, if I say slide rule, they'll say, what? But it's basically a ruler with a central sliding piece and a moving cursor, and it works by logarithmic functions. But anyway, it's a mechanical calculator, to put it simply. And the thing about the slide rule, it would tell you what the answer is, but it will not tell you perfectly where the decimal point lies. So to know whether the correct answer was 10 or 100 or 1,000, you have to have a feel for the context of the problem. So you had to develop this feel, which was thinking in approximations, which would therefore give you that sense of what you were doing. The computer gives you this illusion of exactitude, of precision. But you lose that feel. And Silman says that he talks to young engineers in his office and they'll give him a long printout of a computer model and he'll sort of flip through it and he'll say, you made a mistake here in optimizing the model. And they'll say, how did you see that so fast? And he'll say, that's the way I was trained, because he's reacting with that feel for it. And that feel is important because it's also important to your creativity. I mean, if I'm sketching an idea for a plan and I'm working at 1:100 scale and I draw a line here and I draw a line here, I have a sense, okay, they're roughly 5 meters apart. The computer will ask, no, is it 4.9 or is it 5.1? So it pushes you into this precision you're not ready for. So I think that fuzzy, creative exploration. And then I think a lot of things happen by accident also. Like Charles Correa once told this wonderful story saying that sometimes you sketch one idea, then you put a piece of tracing on top of it and you sketch another version of it. And then you reach for your coffee and your elbow accidentally shifts the top piece of tracing a bit and you say, that's interesting. So there are all these modes of discovery which are also important that we need to stay open to. I know I'll sound like a fuddy-duddy.
Would you like to go back to drawing by hand?
I've never went back to the computer. I always stuck on the pencil.
Nice.
He worked in CNT at one time.
They sent me to learn AutoCAD, and I came back and said I would like to continue with the T-squared and Z-squared.
Right. Done? Oh, give Prem a big applause. I think we'll have a cup of tea outside, and there might be a few other kind of questions, or maybe it's easier to ask a question outside than here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you to Prem and Anna for bringing today's talk and discussion to BIC, and thank you to the audience for your time, interest, and questions. In case you'd like to get to know about future BIC events, there's a QR code that you can scan outside. Thank you again. Good night.